Okay, today let's start with the lesson number one of your supplementary reader, that is Footprints Without Feet. Here in lesson one, Tricky, a small dog, is pampered and overfed by his rich mistress. He falls seriously ill and his mistress consults a veterinary surgeon. Does he perform an operation? Does the dog recover? So we will find out from the lesson these answers for the questions. Why is Mrs. Pamphry worried about Tricky? What does she do to help him? Is she wise in this? Who does I refer to in this story? We will find out these answers from the lesson. Okay, let's start. I was really worried about Tricky this time. Now here I is doctor, that is veterinary doctor. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. Why he was shocked at his appearance? See here, he had become hugely fat. Dog has become very fat, like a bloated sausage. What is sausage? Sausage is an item of food that is cylindrical, minced pork with a leg at each corner. With a means it is looking like a bloated sausage and leg at each corner. His eyes bloodshot and remy. His eyes bloodshot is means inclined with blood, and remy is watery eyes. Whose watery eyes? Tricky's. Stared straight ahead and his tongue lolled with from his jaws. Lolled means in a lazy manner. Okay. Mrs. Pamphry hastened to explain, and he was so listless. Why he was so listless? Mr. Harriet is the doctor, veterinary doctor. He seemed to have no energy. Dog is having no energy, and I thought that he must be suffering from malnutrition. Malnutrition is the lack of proper nutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up, but some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. So she is giving too much, but what she is telling to doctor that nothing much really. So what she was giving Mrs. Pamphry, that is, the list was very it's too much. It seems to have no energy. Who is not having energy? According to Mrs. Pamphry, Tricky is not having energy, so she thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So she has given some extras between meals to build him up, and some malt. What is malt? Malt is to leave grain in water until it starts to grow. Okay, that is malt. And cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Doctor asked her that, did you cut down sweets that I told you? And oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak I had to relent. What she tell to Mr. Harriet, that I did for a bit, but it seemed too weak, so weak that I had to relent. Relent means refuse, or harsh attitude. He does love cream cakes, chocolates, so I can't bear to refuse him. Uh, she's not able to refuse Tricky for the chocolates, cream cakes, and all. I looked again at this little dog. That was the trouble. And that was the trouble. That little dog suffer too much. Why I can't do these things? Why I cut down the chocolates or cream cakes? Tricky's only fault was greed. And what is Tricky's fault? That is only fault, that is greed. Means only fault is he always required something to eat. He had never been known to refuse food. Tricky is not even been refused food any time. He about all the things he would tackle a meal. He would tackle a meal means required a meal at any hour of the day or night. He want meal to eat anytime. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pamfrey hadn't mentioned. And here Mrs. Pamfrey hadn't mentioned in front of the doctor everything about Tricky. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? The doctor asked. Well, she has his little walks with me, as you can see. As you can see that he has having little walk with me. But Hodgkin, the gardener, Hodgkin is the name of the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there has been no ring throwing lately. Lumbago is the muscular disease. So he is not having that activity with the gardener. Which activity? Ring throwing. That activity is not taken by the gardener, as he was suffering from the muscular disease. Okay. I try to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. Now he is going to be really ill because you are not giving sufficient exercise, you are not cutting down his food. Now you must harden your heart, and you have to harden your heart. You have to harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Who has given this advice? Doctor has given this advice to Mrs. Pamfrey. Mrs. Pamfrey wrung his hand. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you're right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down, along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. Now what she is thinking, that I will do, Mr. Harriet, I am sure you're right, but it is too difficult for me to do this thing, to give exercise or to cut off his food. Now she set off, head down and along the road, and now if determined to put the new regime into practice, now we have to put new rules, new regime, new diet for the Tricky immediately. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. Tottering means unsteady. In his little coat, what he was wearing, tweed coat is the rough woolen, that is the Tricky's coat is. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold winter and raincoats for wet days. He struggled on drooping in his harness. Harness is the straps. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pamfrey. Now he struggled on drooping his harness. Who? Tricky. And I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pamfrey. So doctor has given some ideas to just get rid of that disease from Tricky. The expected call came within a few days. Now, expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pamfrey was distraught. Distraught is worried or upset. Tricky would eat nothing. Tricky is not eating anything, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. Bouts of vomiting means he is now having vomiting. That's why he's not eating anything. He spent all his time lying on rug and panting. Panting is he's having panting is breathing very fast. He is just lying on the rug and panting. Didn't want to go for walk and didn't want to do anything. And I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. Means now doctor has a plan to he just have in advance the plans, that the only the idea that the only help to Tricky is get out of that house for a period for some days. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight, to be kept under observation. Fortnight to be kept under observation means 15 days in the hospital, kept under observation. The poor lady almost swooned. Now here he is extremely emotion or shocked. Sumd means shocked. The poor lady was shocked. She was sure she would pine and die. Now she would pine and die without Tricky. If he did not see her every day, so maybe dog was also worried about that. He also want his lady, uh, Mrs. Pamphry every day. He want to see her every day. But I took a firm line. Now he took a firm line for Tricky. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. And this is the only way to save Tricky. Just get out of the house. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay. So what he doctor thought that without delay, just take him out on that moment only. And followed by Mrs. Pamphry's wailing. Wailings is the crying with pain. Now Mrs. Pamphry was crying with pain. I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. Now he marched out. I marched out to the car carrying a little dog in a wrapped blanket like a baby. The entire staff was roused, and maids rushed in and out bringing his day bed, the things of Tricky, day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast ball, lunch ball, supper ball. Supper means dinner ball. And realizing that my car would never hold all these stuff, and doctor thought that my car is not having sufficient space to hold this stuff, and I started to drive away, and just started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pamphry with a despairing cry. Now Mrs. Pamphry was crying, through an armful of his little coats through the window. Just she is throwing the armful of coat in the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. Everybody was crying there for Tricky. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal. Pathetic is sad, or we can say vulnerable. A little animal gasping. Gasping means catch with one breath. He is just gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Because why he was having brave effort? Because Tricky is not in a condition. That's why. Poor old lad. Lad is a boy, a young man. Lad is that. Doctor just said that. Poor old lad. I said, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Now you need a treatment. You will be all right very soon. And glanced means, what is the meaning of glanced? I glanced down at the pathetic. Glanced is hurried look. Okay. Is the narrator as rich as Tricky's mistress? We will find out these questions from the next part. How does he treat the dog? Why is he tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest? Why does Mrs. Pamphry think dog's recovery is the triumph of surgery? Now, at the surgery, the household dogs surged around me. Surgery means the hospital. The household dogs surged around me means crowd around the doctor. Tricky looked down at a noisy pack and dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. Tricky was motionless on the carpet because Tricky was ill. The other dogs, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. And according to other dogs in the hospital, at the surgery, what they decided, that Tricky was an uninteresting object, and they all ignored Tricky. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to one where the other dogs slept. Now doctor made him a bed in a warm box, loose box, and where the other dogs are also slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him. Doctor kept an eye on him, giving him no food, plenty of water to drink. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surrounding. Now, second day, at the end of the second day, now Tricky is showing some interest in his surrounding, and on the third day he began to whimper. Whimper is making feeble sound. When he heard the dogs in the yard, he is just making sound. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted. Trotted means pace faster than a walk, and was immediately engulfed by joy. Sweep over or cover it completely by joy. The grey hound and his friends, after rolling him, means other dogs are also Tricky want to play with other dogs. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Now the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them. Now Tricky also followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Surplus means an amount of something left over, that is surplus fat. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped food for food into the bowls. He's serving the food into the bowls of for the dog. There was the usual headlong rush followed by the sound of high speed eating. Other dogs are having high speed of eating, and they are very that is very headlong rush for Tricky. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the other, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. Means maybe he will not get meal that time, so everyone wants first the meal of that time, so they all want to be one. Here greyhound means that is the breed of the dog which is very tall. Okay, headlong is a long queue, liable is legally. Okay, legally they are in a queue, they are rushing towards the food. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk around the shining bowls. Why the bowls are shining? Because they all licked the balls. That's why. Licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, and then Tricky also just licking casually one or two of them. Next day, the extra ball was put for him. Now the next day, extra ball put for Tricky also, and I was pleased to see him jostling this way towards it. Jostling means push by using elbow or bump against roughly in a crowd. From then on, his progress was rapid. Now his progress was rapid. From that time, he had no medical treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. That is a confused struggle or fight with other dogs. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. Means they are having struggle, a fight, or join means trampling, squashing every few minutes. So this is the exercise which Tricky won. He became an accepted member of the gang. Now he is an accepted member of the gang. An unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger. He is fighting like a tiger. Shaggy is the long hair or fur. For his share at the mealtime, he was like a tiger at the mealtime and hunting rat in the old hen house at night. And he was hunting rats at the night time, and he had never such a time in his life. He was enjoying very much because he had never such a time like with friends in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pamphry hovered means remain at one place or poised hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletin. He wanted to know about Tricky. He made ringing dozen times a day. I dodged the questions about whether the cushions being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly, means recovering rapidly. But the doctor only want to answer one question, that the Tricky was out of danger and he is recovering rapidly. The word convalescing seemed to be to do something to Mrs. Pamphry, means recovering is the word that she was expecting from doctor. She started to bring round fresh egg. Now after recovering word, she is now started to bring round fresh egg, 2 dozens at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. Now she is giving dozen of eggs in the hospital for Tricky. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. He is not giving that egg to Tricky, but doctor and their partners are eating 2 eggs at a time. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to draw on the household, down on the household. See here now, after egg, now when the bottles of wines arriving to the hospital for Tricky, that is the real possibility of the situation that is began to down on the household. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Why wine was Mrs. Pamphry sent wine to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. Now, that is the ceremonial occasion for the doctor and their partners to enjoy wine. Instead of giving Tricky, they all enjoying egg and wine. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. Now, they after that, after wine, that is very the final edge is the brandy for Tricky. So they are enjoying at the night time. Was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. They were days of deep content. Now that the days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, they all are enjoying egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and the midday they are sustained by the wine, and finishing the luxurious round of fire with the brandy. And the night time, that is the brandy time for all the partners with doctor. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. Now they are having temptation to keep the Tricky as a permanent guest in his hospital. But I knew Mrs. Pamphry was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was waiting collection. And but Mrs. Pamphry was suffering there. After a fortnight, she was compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered, and Mrs. Pamphry was waiting there, and I have to give that back Tricky, the dog. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. Gleaming is reflecting like very polished, we can say, outside the surgery. so so here, within a minute, a car was there outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pamphry almost lost in the interior. Her hands was tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" What she want to do? What she want to ask Mr. Harriet, that is the Tricky better or no? Now here, chauffeur means a person employed to drive a car. Yes, he's fine. And Dr. Harriet and doctor just replied, yes, he is fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I will go and fetch him. I will fetch him. I will just you be in the car. No need to come out. I will go and fetch him. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was huddling round and round. So here they all are playing round and round in the lawn and their midst. Ear flapping, tail waving was the little golden figure of Tricky. That is the Tricky, the little ears flapping, tail waving, and that is golden figure. That is Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe. Lithe means supple and graceful, hard muscled animal. He was keeping up well and packed, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground because of fur. Now Tricky became very good in health. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw him, here chauffeur, the driver was still holding a car door open for Tricky. When Tricky When Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms from the doctor's arm in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pamfrey's lap. And she gave a startled ooh and then had to defend herself as a swan over her, licking her face and barking. Who is doing this all? Tricky to Mrs. Pamfrey swam over her, licking her face and barking. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, cushion, all the things in the car. Cushion, coats, balls, none of which had been used for Tricky in the hospital. As the car moved away Mrs. Pamphry leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes and her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, she cried, how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery. Means what she knew, that is the after surgery only Tricky is healthy now. So swarmed means a group of flying insect that is on his face, and the triumph of surgery, and that is the victory only possible because of surgery. So this is the lesson written by James Herriot. Maybe you like the lesson, so keep watching. Thank you.